Nice to see you.
Right on time. How are you, Rob?
Yep, all well, thanks. And thanks for all the support for this.
Next, should we start or wait for one more minute?
We can start.
Okay. All right, so good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. This is Haugen Yao, Education Specialist at UNICEF New York. Welcome to the UNESCO-UNICEF-World Bank Joint Webinar number 11 on the framework for reopening schools. It is already February now, but this is the first webinar for 2021, so I guess it is not too late to say Happy New Year to all of you. This webinar will focus on the costing of learning in the post-COVID era, including remote learning, digital learning, school reopening, and more systematic development of human-centered ICT-based education. And the webinar idea actually started from a discussion between the UNICEF CIDR team and the World Bank SIF team last October. There has been an increasing demand of costing tools, and we are glad to see that the webinar has come true, and the two we have been developing are ready to go public. The agenda for today will begin with opening remark by Rob Jenkins, Chief of Education UNICEF, and Susanna Gwen-Lewis, Director of IEP UNESCO. We will then proceed to the panel session with colleagues from Abraham Foundation, UNICEF, and the World Bank, presenting tools from different angles and serving different purposes. The panel will be chaired by Sobi Tawi, Director of Future of Learning and Innovation UNESCO, and Omar Arias, Manager of Education Global Practice from World Bank, will be our discussions. We are going to close the session with remarks by Nicolas Rouge, Senior Education Advisor, UNICEF. During the session, just a reminder, please mute your microphone when you are not speaking. Feel free to pose your questions to the panelists through the chat box. French and Spanish simultaneous interpretation are provided. You can see a small icon at the bottom of the screen. The final version of the PowerPoints and accompanying documents will later be uploaded to the Joint Webinar webpage. Without further delay, let's welcome Robert Jenkins, Chief of Education UNICEF, for the opening remark. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks very much, Haugen. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, dear friends and colleagues and partners around the world. It's great to see you all virtually. Thank you very much for taking time out of your busy schedules to attend and participate. We look forward to your active engagement in this important topic. Also, I'd like to give a shout out to Suzanne Lewis, my dear friend, the director from IAP. She's up next, and also dear friends and colleagues from the bank and others. This World Bank UNESCO-UNICEF partnership has been vital for us to work so closely together at the global level, but also at country level in responding to a crisis of this magnitude. It's something we greatly appreciate. Well, at risk of sort of stating the obvious, I will spend my very brief time just highlighting and contextualizing this conversation. We all recognize the challenge that COVID-19 has placed on education and on education budgets. We all have been working very proactively and closely together on advocating for the protection and effective use of the education budget. So we're looking at the magnitude of the resources and also the quality and use of those resources. Those conversations are very much alive and well globally and in countries all around the world. There were global campaigns, including Save Our Future, as I think many, if not everyone on the call will know, coordinated by the Education Commission. The Smart Buys report was a contribution to this conversation, which was launched by the World Bank, and many papers and webinars have been organized by UNESCO and by others to continue this discussion around, again, protecting education budgets in terms of absolute amounts, but also how those resources have been used. We do, however, recognize that education continues to face, as a sector, an uphill battle on terms of making the impact of COVID-19 on education visible in the policymaking space, and also by ensuring decision makers are fully aware of the importance of continuing to invest in education in the short term to enable the effective reopening, but medium and long term to enable the much needed transformation. We all recognize the importance of the digital divide. I know all of you on this call will know the very important increasing evidence of the impact of the digital divide on learning and the importance of investing in overcoming that. I think we're all increasingly convinced that we have a once-in-a-generation opportunity right now to leapfrog education into by transforming the way curriculums and learning materials reach children and children engage in their own learning, but also in addressing long-standing marginalization of certain children and providing comprehensive support to children as they re-enter schooling and continue on their learning pathway. But we also recognize resources are critical to enable this vision to be realized. We have recognized that the potential across the world is unparalleled, and we look forward to working with all of you to me it's seeing these innovative perspective, innovative thoughts, innovative new approaches now being translated into systemic change as schools reopen and recover. So let me provide a quick overview of the webinar before handing over to my friend Sue. There will be 4 presentations today covering a wide range of cost tools for building back education better and recovering education. They're applicable to various cases from early childhood education all the way to tertiary, from programming to education sector planning, and from short-term and to long-term change. So you'll see quite a wide variety and scope. All the glue that holds us all together is overall looking at the necessary resources and how those resources will be utilized. Some are also looking beyond education, as I've mentioned, looking at other services and other support that children require that are traditionally housed in other sectors, for example, in health, hygiene, and information communication technology, connecting schools, etc. So also we're taking quite a broad perspective on the issue. I hope you'll enjoy the session. I hope you'll continue to collaborate and engage in this important topic. And I very much look forward to the discussion. I think, Haojin, I'm supposed to pass back to you.
Thank you very much, Rob. We are also very honored to have Susan Gwen-Lewis, Director of IEP UNESCO, to deliver her welcoming remark. The floor is yours, Sue.
Thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to be with all of you today. I'd like to share some thoughts on the importance of costing, which should be considered, of course, in the larger costing, financing, budgeting, and expenditure tracking continuum. Education simulation modeling is a powerful tool that countries use to anticipate the resource requirements over a given time based on their policies and their targets. Results from simulation models often ignite policy dialogue and debate, and they support countries in making difficult but important policy decisions on where and how they should focus investments in education. So using a robust simulation model has become an integral part of education sector planning, and it's critical as countries plan to implement SDG 4 Education 2030 agenda. We know in educational planning that at the best of times, costing can be difficult. However, in crises, as we are experiencing today with the COVID-19 pandemic, there are additional difficulties. Data that has to be used for the simulation may be less available. There may be additional logistical constraints which carry additional costs, for example, to collect the data. There may be high volatility of the unit costs in a crisis context. And the financial consequences of school closures and discontinuity of learning may be difficult to estimate. In addition, governments also face difficulties in setting realistic objectives, which are really required during the simulations because they're dependent on setting some priorities and some reasonable objectives. So we are in a more difficult situation. Nonetheless, it's really important that we try to advance our understanding of actual costing of things. It's also important for us to realize that we're operating in several temporal frames to build back better. We have the immediate, and there are a number of costs, many of which might be once-off costs, for example, renovations to structure or resources to ensure health and sanitation in the range of educational settings. There may be back-to-school campaigns or vaccination of school personnel most at risk or provision of psychosocial support for students, teachers, and staff. We have medium-term costs, such as the provision of context-relevant alternative delivery modes, and we're going to be talking about the costing of those today. Or it could be assessing the learning losses and the remedial action required, or the provision or scaling up of support to teachers, be it mentoring for online pedagogy or what have you. And of course, the longer term costs for building a quality and equitable education system that will serve society and the world in the longer term. Not everything can be implemented at once, but nonetheless, we need to estimate costs. Now, the COVID-19 crisis can be perceived as an opportunity to, as Rob said, change the way education services are delivered. But all the traditional broad questions regarding credibility, sustainability, feasibility remain, and are arguably even more important in this context. Costing models are part of a set of tools that are essential to assess these dimensions. They're also a prerequisite for successful implementation, and they have a major role to play beyond just the general objective of costing. I think that I wanted to put in just a plug for an area, a subsector which IIEP is working on, and that is early childhood education. There are a series of initiatives, as I'm sure colleagues will say later, about costing education, early childhood education services, and from the standardized early childhood development costing tool sect, from Brookings and JPAL costing guidelines, etc. And this is an area we really need to make progress on because we're not capitalizing on what we know from our research about how effective early childhood care and education are. Let me close just by reminding us that we must be sure we're connecting costing with financing, budgeting, and ultimately expenditure tracking. And just a reminder that budgeting is not the same as what actually gets spent and the focus of it, as we know from national education accounts. We want to call attention to the latest World Education blog, which was published just yesterday with the Education Finance Watch 2021. This is a collaboration of the UNESCO Global Education Monitoring Report and the World Bank, and it's warned us that education budgets are not adjusting proportionally to the challenges brought about by COVID, especially in poorer countries. It warns that future cuts may be larger as the pandemic continues to take its economic toll and its fiscal positions worsen. And secondly, the differing trends between low and high income countries in their budgets suggest a larger spending disparities. And this is a concern for all of us. Let me leave it there. I'm looking forward to the presentations. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sue. I think you mentioned a very important point. Costing is more like a first step, but then there's budgeting, financing, and tracking, and even management. Let's hope that maybe we can have further webinars on these topics as well. And also thank you again to Rob for the delivery of the opening remark. In the interest of time, we will now pass the mic to Sobi, Director of Future of Learning and Innovation, UNESCO, for the panel. The floor is yours, Sobi.
Thank you very much, Haugen, and welcome again to all. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this webinar, one in the series of joint webinars on costing of learning and looking at what needs to be considered in estimating the cost of school reopening and of distance and hybrid learning, and what tools are available. We've got an excellent panel. We will have 4 presentations. First by Alika Holle from the World Bank, who is the program manager for the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund. Next from Haugen from UNICEF, who introduced the webinar. Third presentation by Yilin Pan from the World Bank on costing of reopening plans, and a fourth and final presentation by Shiraz Shakira from UNICEF and Andy Cunningham from the Aga Khan Foundation. Following the 4 presentations, we will have Omar Arias from the World Bank as a discussant, and then we'll open up to questions from the audience. So just like to recall also that you can put your questions in the chat as of the very first presentation. So we'll start with the first presentation, Alika, on capturing cost data in remote learning. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Sobi. So as Sobi, and thank you for having me, Haugen, thanks for inviting us and organizing this. So as Sobi mentioned, I am the program manager of something at the World Bank called the Strategic Impact Evaluation Fund. We fund evaluations, mostly randomized controlled trials in the human development sectors. And to make our estimates more relevant for policy, as Sue argued in the introduction, we have started a program on costs. And today I'm going to tell you about one of the tools that we've developed, but I'm mostly going to focus on the principles that we followed in developing this tool and the tool that my colleague Yilin will tell you about, and the reasons why we follow these principles. And so we started with the question, what is the best way to deliver remote instruction, right? So countries have many options, or some countries have many options for reaching children at home. They can do it through the radio, through television, through online instruction. Teachers can call up children, and countries rightfully want to know what's the best way to deliver this. What should we be doing given our context and given our constraints? And randomized controlled trials can tell us about the effectiveness of doing this. So what benefits would accrue of different implementation modalities? But as we all know, most countries and most school systems operate under budget constraints. So knowing what's the best in terms of learning or in terms of engagement is not always the only thing that you need to know. You also need to know what are the costs of doing this. And so one thing that we did, we have a emergency window. We put out a call for proposals. We have an emergency window of evaluations focused solely on evaluating different digital modalities to deliver remote instruction to children. And we developed a template. So those randomized controlled trials will tell us about effectiveness. And so what we did at CEF was we developed an Excel-based template to estimate the costs of those types of interventions. They were all doing very similar things. They were either encouraging families and children to engage with the remote instruction that was already being offered in the country, or they were actually delivering remote instruction directly to the household. And so what we did was we developed a template to estimate these costs, which is publicly available on our website. And we followed, in developing this template, we followed some principles that we had previously outlined in a document called Capturing Cost Data that we had done jointly with the International Rescue Committee. And today I'm going to kind of step you through some of those principles and argue why it's very important to follow those principles. And so before I do that, I think it's kind of important and useful to take a step back and ask what kind of attributes we want cost data to have, right? So, and to do this, I think it's easier to think about, not to think about digital technologies and all the options that countries may have, but just to think of a much simpler decision, a personal decision, which is buying a house, right? So when we're buying a house, we want the price that we use to consider buying that house, we want it to be accurate, right? So we don't want to have a house price and then after signing a contract, our real estate agent to tell us, actually, this price is 50% higher than what you thought it was. Right? We don't expect that in making this kind of decision. And in fact, there are laws in many countries to prevent that exact thing from happening. At the same time, we don't just want the price to be accurate, we want it to be relevant to the decision we're making. So when we're buying a house, it really doesn't help us to have a very accurate estimate of the cost of the windows of the house, right? So we want, the decision we're making is buying the whole house. And so whether it's accurate or not, knowing the cost of just the windows is not really relevant to the decision that we're making. And these attributes of accuracy and relevance are also attributes we should demand of the programs that we're implementing to help kids get through the pandemic and beyond. And I'm going to kind of show you why, quantitatively, why it's very important to have these attributes of our cost estimates. And so before I kind of get into detail, I just wanted to show you what these list of attributes that we mean when we say accuracy, we mean cost data that is disaggregated, is specific to the intervention that we care about, not a much larger program or not the sector, but the intervention that we're deciding to invest in or not. This data is collected in real time and it's collected from multiple sources. It's a bit easier to define relevance. So cost data is relevant when it's tailored to the decision that's being made, right? So if you're buying a whole house, you want the cost of the whole house, not the cost of the windows, and vice versa. If you're just redoing your windows, it doesn't really help to have the cost of the whole house. And so our evaluations of our COVID emergency window are still wrapping up, so I don't have numbers for you there, but I want to illustrate kind of the quantitative importance of accuracy and relevance using a case study from Bangladesh that we did before the pandemic. So we had an evaluation in our portfolio from Bangladesh that was looking at the effectiveness of adding another year of preschool. So the government was already giving 5-year-olds a year of pre-primary education. And this evaluation was looking at what if you extended this to 4-year-olds so that children had 2 years of preschool before they entered first grade. Okay. And this was a great evaluation. This is why we chose this as a case study for costing. The intervention we knew was implemented well by Save the Children and it had already been running for a year. There was already implementation data. By the midline, there was already high impacts estimated through a randomized controlled trial. And this was piloted in government schools, right? So there was already, by design, some potential for scale. But when we asked, so we came in 1 year, the evaluation started in the 2nd year of the program. When we came in, there was already, the program had already been running for a year. And so we asked for the budget so we could have some sense ex ante what they thought this program would cost for the next year. And when we first asked for financial records, we got an aggregate budget. A very aggregate budget that looked something like this. And before I tell you what's missing from the program budget, I want you to first notice that there was actually extra stuff in this program budget. So there were expenditures that were not linked to this extra year of preschool program, which is understandable because this office, that was keeping records doesn't think of specific programs, but thinks of their whole program looking at early childhood development, right? So there were expenditures in their budget that really were not specific to one singular, the program that we were interested in. And I think it's also important to go through and to think about what is missing from program budgets more generally. And I usually take the time to answer this question because whenever people are asking me what's so difficult about costing, our organization or our project keeps such great detailed implementation records and financial records. It's important to kind of really step through this and see what we're missing from most of these records. First, when you look at an aggregate budget, you'll see that there's very little disaggregation. So usually there's things like personnel. If you're lucky, there's something called management. And then there's just very big categories like materials and equipment. And it's very difficult, and there's kind of totals. It's very difficult to be able to verify this because we don't know quantities, we don't know prices. So when you see school personnel, we don't know, is this staff? Is this a psychologist? Does this include the cost of supervision? Does this include cleaning costs and maintenance costs? Or does that show up elsewhere? Are we double counting this? When you see materials, you have no idea what materials were purchased. And so this makes it very difficult to predict, were you to implement this in another year or in another setting, how many resources you would need. So in addition to there being little disaggregation, we already talked about there isn't most of the time in these aggregate budgets, there isn't intervention specificity, particularly if the organization is working on multiple related projects, in this case, in the early childhood development sector. Also missing from these aggregate budgets is a dimension of time. So we really don't know when these expenditures are happening. Do you need all of the outlay up front? When the program starts, are these expenditures that are happening over time? It's often very difficult to tell when you get a very aggregate budget. So how do we actually get data that is disaggregated and intervention specific? So I just outlined all these problems with the standard records that are kept. So how do we get data that does not have these problems? So in the kind of costing community, we usually advocate for something called an ingredients-based approach, which is also sometimes called activity-based costing or micro-costing. So all of these are kind of usually the same word for the same approach, which is to just literally list everything that is needed to make an intervention happen, the quantity of those resources, the price of those resources, and their intensity of use. Okay, and this cost data, we wish that it was just sitting in one kind of magic spreadsheet that would make our life easier. We could just go find that magic spreadsheet. But unfortunately, cost data, you have to put it together. It comes from multiple sources. So first is the budget and the expenditure. That's not useless information. It's just not sufficient. It also comes from monitoring and evaluation, right? So on paper, you might be thinking your supervisors are visiting kind of project sites or program sites once a month. The M&E records will usually tell you if this is happening really once a month or if this is happening once every 4 months. Sometimes, the M&E records are not sufficient, and so you actually have to go into the field and see the program in action. So I had this experience with an early childhood program where on paper, it looked as though materials were given to households, play materials and early stimulation materials. When I saw this program on the ground, materials were never given to households and they were deliberately kept back from households. If I had solely used kind of a description of this project on paper, I would have costed all the materials when in fact, there were no materials in this program. You often have to interview people, particularly to get their allocation of time. most people are working on multiple things, and this might not show up in any kind of records. And so you might have to talk to people, and you might have to do surveys. So I list all these resources for data because most people think of just the spreadsheet that's just waiting for you to analyze, but really to gather cost data, you are going to have to kind of do an investigation that requires looking through spreadsheets, but also talking to human beings. The second kind of principle that you want to follow to increase the accuracy of your cost data is to get it in real time. So typically, I've listed a timeline for an intervention and where cost data collection and kind of thinking about cost data should happen. So this is kind of ideal. I want to contrast it with what happens when people who are not following this ingredients-based approach, what they do. They usually do this at the end when they're finalizing the results of an impact evaluation or doing an economic evaluation at the close of a project. That's when they start thinking about cost data. And that is the wrong time to start thinking about cost data. When you do that, your cost data is not going to be very accurate. People forget, particularly for labor, people forget how much or even how little they've worked on a project. So when you are waiting till the last minute to gather this information, it's not going to be very accurate. Ideally, you're setting up your cost data collection as you're setting up the intervention so that as expenditures are happening or as people are working on certain parts of the intervention, you're capturing that information. And lastly, I want to stress that you are getting this data from all contributors. So very rarely is just one entity paying for an intervention, particularly like a complex kind of intervention that is a reform of a sector. You have government working on it. You have donors, you might have NGOs. In the case of digital technology, you will also have private firms. You may have communities or households themselves having to contribute to the intervention. And you want to make sure that you get all these contributions from all these different actors. And so I just want to illustrate the importance of this from Bangladesh. So when we went in and just asked for the program records, we got a cost, an implied total cost of the program that was around $27,000. When we used an ingredients-based approach, collected the data in real time, got it from all sources and all contributors, our estimate of the program went up to $157,000. So that went up by more than a factor of 5. Okay, so we solved the accuracy problem. I just want to end with talking about relevance of cost data, of the cost data. So as I told you, the total cost of the program was $157,000. Now this is the full economic cost of the program. So this is, if you were interested in answering the question, is it worth implementing this? Will there be a benefit to society of implementing this, which is usually what governments and donors are interested in? That would be the cost of the program. If you just said, I'm only interested in the costs of the organization that implemented this and only the financial costs, forget the costs of other contributors. It doesn't matter that households paid. It doesn't matter that another donor paid. In this case, you get a drop of 24% of the implied costs. But it's important to note, this is something that the financial team of the implementer should be interested in, not someone who's asking the question, does this net, does this program net an increase in welfare? Similarly, we might want to strip out management costs, and that again will decrease our estimate of the cost of the program. We might also want to strip out both management and financial costs, and that will drop our estimate of costs by 70%. I point out these numbers, and you see there's a large difference between $43 and $145 per child per year. I point these out because I have often seen the latter estimate. So this estimate that's stripped of management costs, stripped of the total cost of the program when multiple organizations are implementing it. And I've seen that number being used in cost effectiveness analyses and cost benefit analyses that are aimed to sway policy. And that's just kind of like a caveat emptor I want to make, when this is exactly like the case when you want to buy the whole house and someone is quoting the price of the windows to you. And so just to close, like, what does this mean on the best way, finding out what's the best way to deliver remote instructions? I just want to stress that choosing the right mode requires an understanding of cost, not just an understanding of benefits, and that these costs need to be both accurate and relevant. So a micro-costing approach can help with accuracy, and we've developed a tool for remote instruction, encouraging households to use remote instruction that's publicly available. My colleague Yilin will talk about another tool that we're also making publicly available that's designed more holistically to look at the costs of reopening. But also I want to stress in this context and any other context, we also have to have costs that are relevant. So we have to ask, who is using this? Is it the government? Is it a donor? Is it the product developer? That's very relevant in the case of digital technologies. Is it the parent buying a service for their child? And why are they asking for, what decision is actually being made? Is it policy action? Is it investment? Are you purchasing something? Are you hiring someone? These are all questions related to accuracy and relevance that are important to ask when you're doing a costing analysis. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alika, and thank you for illustrating the different dimensions of costing remote learning, both the illustration and the illustration from Bangladesh in terms of the accuracy, the need for disaggregated data that's specific to the intervention, collected in real time, and from multiple sources, and the relevance dimension that you've pointed out, relevant for what decision on the part of whom. I just want to recall before going to the next presentation that you can put your comments and ask any questions in the chat. We've got one now that I would like to flag already when we come back to towards the end of the webinar. It's about the costing of early childhood education and development programs, and any reactions from the panelists in terms of experiences in costing, the reopening, the re-enrollment of children, and also ensuring that teachers and educators are returned and are maintained in the system. So please do feel free to put in your comments and your questions. And now I'd like to move to the second presentation, which will give an overview of some of the costing tools for digital learning. Juan, again, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sobi. So it's me again as presenter. The topic is a snapshot of costing tools for digital learning. So I'm supposed to maybe share several tools, but luckily, because many of these tools would be presented by other panel members. So I guess for my session, I would just focus on the macro costing tool, which I'm going to have a deeper dive. Let's start about the costing tools. In the previous section, Alaka already introduced the micro costing. So I would say that since the outbreak of the pandemic, there are 3 types of costing tool for digital learning. The micro costing, which are fixed for intervention or program planning in a specific location. The meso costing, which are good for district level or country level costing. And the macro costing, which are good for country or even global cost estimates. A typical example of micro costing is the World Bank template for costing remote learning encouragement, which is actually available online. It's more appropriate for guiding intervention planning it has the advantage in terms of cost effectively analysis once the program move forward, and is good for disaggregation, as the previous PowerPoint mentioned. And for method costing, there's this digital learning toolkit, which include a costing part developed by Aga Foundation and UNICEF, and that would be the fourth presentation of today's webinar, so I'll skip. There's also UNICEF Distant Learning Costing tool developed for our country office in Sub-Saharan Africa, and I believe with some little adjustment, it can be used for other countries of other regions as well. This method costing tool might be better in terms of integration of digital learning into education sector response or planning. And lastly, the guide price generator for conducting digital learning. I'm going to spend more time on that later. Is good for fast track estimates to kickstart cost discussion globally. And you can see these 3 types of costs, they are different in terms of the accuracy and the time you need to spend, because there are different contributors engaged in terms of the data for the tool to operate. So about this macro costing tool, the UNICEF Guide Price Generator is basically a tool we developed to assist the planning of a Reimagining education initiative, which was also mentioned by Rob in his opening. It's a very easy to use tool. If you don't want any customization, you just need 2 clicks to get a cost results for a country. It's based on a lot of assumptions, but you also allow a lot of customization. It generates the cost estimate as top-up spending for digital learning. By saying top-up, I'm stressing that if this is a spending that can exist even without digital learning, then it should not be counted here. For example, hiring more teachers. You still need to hire more teachers even without digital learning. So this is not counted in this tool. And the tool will be released soon and will be updated annually, although it's currently being used by UNICEF internally. Just a little bit more detail about Reimagining education. It has the vision of providing quality digital learning to all child and young person, that's basically like 0 to 24 years old, by 2030. It's under the partnership among Generation Unlimited, which focus on young people engagement, Giga, which focus on connecting every school to internet, and the UNICEF. And there are 5 pillars of Reimagining education. I would say when doing the costing, we can also have the cost aligned to these 5 pillars. And they are more like 5 parts of an iceberg. We can consider the cost as an iceberg. For the part of iceberg above the sea level, the device, the digital solution, and the engagement of the public, especially young people, to raise awareness and scaling up. These are the costs that are more visible. They are the costs of conducted digital learning. Just to also emphasize that within digital solution, there are also a lot of detailed items, including the content, upskilling, data analytics, etc. When saying upskilling, is for both teachers and facilitators, because in humanitarian situation, sometimes you can't have real teacher in payroll. And also for early childhood development, like for young children that are not even at the age of going to kindergarten, we might need to upskill their parents so their parents know how to better engage in digital learning. So these items above the sea level can be addressed by the guide price generator. And for the items that are less visible, but probably much larger, they are under the sea, that including the data. We need to use data when connecting the internet, and of course the connectivity to internet. Electricity is also important. It's so fundamental that I would consider it as the sea instead of the iceberg. There are still countries where over 80% of population do not have access to electricity, it's not realistic to talk about digital learning when we cannot resolve the electricity problem for them. And for these kind of items, we do have global estimates from some global reports or database. Now we finally go to the tool. As I mentioned, it's a very simple, easy to use tool. There are only 3 slides on that. In the interest of time, I'm not going to say anything about the assumption applied or the calculations, but there would be a research brief published on the Office of Research UNICEF website when the tool are also published. So their details are there. And the cost estimate in this tool, we are using those widely available and frequently updated data, such as enrollment, population, learning poverty index by the World Bank, and access to internet. But we also allow the user to do their own imputation in case they have more specific requests. You may recall that I mentioned the two are very simple. You can use 2 clicks to get result. Here's 1 click, just click the star. Then we go to the simulation page. In the simulation page, there's the second click, step 1. Click the yellow space to choose a country. We have over 200 country or economy in the tool. And then step 2 is optional. You can click the green space here to customize the costing table that will be automatically generated and updated. For example, you can choose what percentage of the curricula to be migrated online. Here the default is 30%, but you can choose other figure. And if you are not satisfied with the option provided, you can click need more option and do your own input. And this is the table that will be automatically generated once you finish the click. In this case, you can see that the cost estimate are listed out for each item. And it also gives you, in the last 2 rows, it gives you the estimated number of possible beneficiaries, as well as the marginal cost per learner reach. And in this case, it's $27 per learner reach. Because of the customization function, we can actually get a very wide range of estimates based on the selection of parameters. For example, for Afghanistan, to conduct digital learning to different age groups with different quality, you can get a cost estimate result range from 40.7 million only to 7.4 billion. Just some user case of this tool, how it was used. And here's a case of making estimate of indicated costs for reimagining education in the so-called education 9 countries. You can see that we are able to give a rough estimate about the cost in terms of electricity, accessibility, connectivity, and affordable data based on global database or reports. And then we are able to use the cost tool to make estimate for the device, digital solution, and engagement. We also provide different scenario, like frugal scenario or progressive scenario. There's a long footnote here, and you can download the PPT after this section and to have a look at the detail of the footnote. Some of you may also be interested in knowing the global estimate. As I said, it's capable of global estimate. So here is the iceberg again about how much more it will cost for our world to frugally achieve digital learning for all by 2030. It's 46.4 billion to conduct and 1.34 trillion to enable. That's equivalent to less than 1% of public education expenditure, plus 3% of the energy investment, and plus 5% of the telecommunication market revenue in 2019. As you can see, this is definitely cost settled, and cost settled course requires cost settled investment. It is not really it's not a small investment for sure, but it's also not really mission impossible, as long as there's a shared commitment and action plan. I would say there's still a large space for improvement for the tool in terms of increasing the accuracy and relevance while keeping it simple. So we look forward to more practice and improvement of these tools with you. Thank you very much. Over back to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Haugen, for that. First of all, for categorizing between the micro, meso, and macro tools, and then for demonstrating the use of the UNICEF guide on and price generator with the different dimensions of costing in what you call the 5 pillars of reimagining education. On the overall cost of achieving universal digital learning, yes, I mean, shocking in a way, but as you say, you know, put in relative terms compared to other costs and investments, something that can be done if we are serious about it. I'd like to move on to Yilin Pan from the World Bank, also for a presentation on costing tool for the reopening of schools, costing plans for the reopening of schools.
Thank you so much, Selby.
The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Selby. And thank you so much for having me. In this session, I'm going to introduce Excel-based tool that my colleagues Alaka, Nobu Tanaka, and I are developing. The tool aims to help you to cost out school reopening plans, as many countries are working towards bring children back to in-person classes. I want to mention that this is still a beta version of the tool, which means we're still testing it with our colleagues within the World Bank, especially task team leaders and country offices. We look forward to feedback outside of the World Bank. So if you have any feedback or if you intend to collaborate, please let us know. So why did we get interested in developing this tool? As Robert and Sue emphasized in the opening remarks, many countries are facing severe financial challenges to operate schools safely and to address the consequences of the pandemic. So on one hand, substantial resources are needed to protect the safety of the education community, sustain learning and mitigate learning loss, support emotional well-being, and also reach the most marginalized or vulnerable population. All of these activities, usually required or recommended by school reopening plans, will increase the cost or the spending of providing education services. At the same time, on the other hand, we see that the economic recession has caused budget cuts in many, many countries. So we do think that it is important to identify the financial gap so that governments, schools, international community, international organizations, donors can work together to raise money and also to reallocate resources. So with this background in mind, what is this tool for? The tool serves two purposes. One is to guide budgeting and financing. In particular, the tool is going to guide you through the process to identify the additional resources needed and the intensive use to do all these things. In the tool, we call them pillars. And then specify funding sources and assess whether a funding gap exists. In addition to that, we also hope this tool could serve to guide implementation and planning. I'm just going to take safe operations as one example. So in order to cost it out, you really need to specify what measures you want to adopt to keep teachers and students safe. For example, reduce the number of students taking school buses, everybody wearing masks, do more cleaning, etc. And then you need to ask what resources and the intensity of use to make this happen. How many, for example, how many masks do we need? How many cleaners are there? And how often they're going to clean? All of these details related to measures and resources are going to help schools get to know what to do when they reopen schools. This is especially important when school reopening plans lack specific details. Next, what can you get from this tool? The first product is a report in the format of a dashboard. It is look like this. It is automatically generated and can be easily printed out. If we zoom in, you will see on the left side, it specifies the context for your analysis. On the top right, there's a figure showing the cost of additional resources needed, funding available, the funding gap. We also summarize the financial cost and the economic cost of the additional resources by pillar. The financial cost is the outlay or the money you need to pay now. The economic cost takes into consideration that many of the investment can be used for a longer time. So you invest now, but you don't need to invest it again later because they could be used for a long time, such as laptops and computers. So that's why you see the economic cost for sustained learning is lower than its financial cost. A second pre-populated product is this list of resources to purchase, especially materials and equipment. It is pre-populated. You can format it as well. You can easily pass it to the planning department and the procurement department. So now you know the products. Who would use the information? We think the information could be useful for government officials, school leaders, international organizations, and donors who are involved in the planning, budgeting, and financing of school reopening. But these people are decision makers. They are unlikely to be able to sit down and fill out the spreadsheet. So we recommend that the people who fill out the spreadsheet should be the government officials or school leaders in the budget unit. They're very likely to be assigned to do this task of estimating cost to reopen schools, regardless whether they use this tool or not. In addition to that, we do think researchers, donors, and international organizations could use the tool to provide technical assistance for governments. Okay, now let's go to how is the tool structured. The tool is composed of 10 spreadsheets, starting with a short introduction. We will also have a menu that provides more detailed information on how to use the tool. And then there are 3 spreadsheets that requires your inputs. That is to specify the measures you want to adopt, provide basic information about schools, and predict school reopening status. Then the next 4 spreadsheets leads you through the process to identify the quantity and the prices of the additional resources, specify funding. For items that are not easy to determine the quantity, we also provide a calculator to lead you through that process. The last 2 spreadsheets automatically generate the report and the list of items to purchase. You don't need to do anything. These are the products that I showed you before. So in all, there are 10 spreadsheets, but don't freak out. You only need to work on 7. Now you know why we did the tool, what the tool is about, how flexible and adaptable is the tool. We acknowledge that different countries have different needs, have different capacities and resource availabilities. So it is important to mention that the adaptability, we try to make the tool as adaptable, as flexible as possible. So next, I'm going to use a few examples to show how its adaptability, flexibility, and adaptability and applicability. So suppose this is me wearing my white shirt. And here are a few colleagues from governments, from international organizations, schools, donors, and they're going to ask me a few questions about whether they could use the tool in their own context for their own needs. So the first question is, can I use the tool if we do not have a concrete school reopening plan beyond a brief guideline? The answer is yes. The reason is we have done the work for you to expand the 4 pillars into 25 measures, and then translate these 25 measures into more than 80 resources. The cost will be automatically calculated based on the measures you select, the resources you specify, the quantities and their prices. This 4-pillar framework is based on the report published by UNESCO, UNICEF, the World Bank, World Food Programme, and UNHCR. We also reviewed a lot of great work made by our colleagues in UNICEF, UNESCO, CDC, and many other organizations, and we summarized 25 measures to adopt in all these 4 pillars. They're listed in this spreadsheet. Please notice that it does not mean you need to adopt all 25. All you need to do is to look at the list and check the ones that apply to your context. And then once you check that, a list of resources associated with your checked measures will pop up in following spreadsheets, such as quantity and prices. I'll give you an example for on the spreadsheet planned measures, you check provide on-site screening, and then go to quantity, list of resources related to it will pop up, and we'll have prompt questions to help you identify the quantity as well. Okay, there's another question saying, can local governments and schools use the tool? Also, this colleague asked, can I use the tool for early childhood education? I think there's a similar question in the chat as well. So my answer is yes and yes. This tool is not specific to a specific type of users or to a specific education level. We help you to identify the context using 3 dimensions. First is location. The second is education level. And the third is time period. Here I'm just using a semester system as an example. So if you want to cost out this, that will be primary, lower secondary, upper secondary education for the whole country in the time period of spring 2021. And in the tool, on the spreadsheet basic information, you only need to do a few clicks and fill out a few text boxes. Just responding to the question that raised by the colleague, most of the measures are generic to all kinds of different, all kinds of education levels, but there are certain measures that are specific to certain ages. For example, a very recent report by WHO specified that children aged under 5 should not advise to wear masks. So in that case, we made very clear in the tool about these guidelines. Another question is about the uncertainty of the situation. Since the trajectory of the pandemic is unpredictable, we really don't know how many schools can actually open next semester. Can we still use the tool? The answer is yes. So in this tool, we help you to make assumptions on the percentage of schools that provide in-person classes and the percentage of students who attend in-person classes. Your assumptions will be factored into analysis automatically. So you can easily change these assumptions to check the range of costs in different scenarios. So this colleague asks another question, can we use the tool in the next stage of the pandemic? For example, after vaccines are well rolled out, hopefully? The answer is yes. The reason is it's very likely that the consequences of the pandemic will linger for a while, even if we don't need to worry too much about safety. There's substantial learning loss that need to address. anxiety is prevailing, and also other emotional problems. The lack of treatment for disability students, dropout of girls, all this marginalized, vulnerable population need to be reached. So as time goes by, there might be less concerns here, but we'll try to enrich the measures and resources in these pillars. Last but not least, micro-costing or ingredients-based costing, activity-based costing, as Alaka introduced, help to generate accurate cost estimate, but we don't have the time capacity to do it. Is that still okay? Yes, that's still okay. In addition to the measures, the features that I introduced, like all the spreadsheets are connected, and the reports are pre-populated. I'm just quickly show a few more features that we hope to make your life easier. So first, you can click shortlist, and then only the resources that are big ticket item, the resources that cannot be compromised for the measure will be show up. And that could reduce your workload for about 20% to 30%. There are calculators to help you. And also, whenever possible, when there are guidelines, recommendations, we have already filled out the default settings for you. Okay, in summary, we hope this tool could be useful to cost our school reopening plan, identify the financial gap, and guide the implementation of school reopenings. We're working towards improving the usability of the tool by adopting like a wizard interface. That means what you fill out in the previous spreadsheet will be reflected in the latest spreadsheet. All the calculations are automated, and the reports are pre-populated, and it's flexible enough to adjust to different types of scenarios. If you're interested in testing the tool with us, please get in touch. Is the QR code to link to our emails. I'm also going to paste our emails into the chat box. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen, and thanks for presenting the tool for costing school reopening plans in the context where the spending needs are rising, and we know the pressures on funding and public financing of education are increasing. And thanks for illustrating that specifically with regard to the safe reopening, and indicating that this is also can be adapted and used at different levels, including for early childhood. There is a question in the chat. I just, before moving to our last presentation, just to have that in mind as well, that perhaps the focus, or a comment, I mean, that the focus is very much on ensuring, reopening and continuity of learning. But how about the costing of reducing, eliminating inequalities that are only, which were there pre-COVID closures and which have only increased during this period. I just wanted to flag that since we are running also a little late. And then to introduce our last presentation, Shiraz Shakira from UNICEF and Andy Cunningham from the Aga Khan Foundation to present the digital learning tool. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Let me just share the presentation, and hopefully colleagues can see that. So thank you very much, Sophie, for that introduction, and thank you hugely to Jen and the other organizers of this webinar. It's a great pleasure and privilege for us to speak alongside such an expert and esteemed panel, and speak to such a diverse audience, many of whose names I recognize and know are doing amazing work to improve education in their context. So we're going to talk about a new tool, the Digital Learning Toolkit, that locates costing within a wider strategic development. We're going to introduce the digital learning toolkit, give a bit of background about where it came from, unpack a bit what is in it and how to use it, and then we'll talk a bit about how you might want to deploy it in your context. And so, the Digital Learning Toolkit provides a holistic and inclusive human-centered design process to developing an investment plan for digital learning. It incorporates costing tools, and due to its modular and flexible structure, can actually incorporate other costing tools, including those that we've heard today. But it locates those costing tools beyond a pure costing exercise into a wider strategic process that is about linking investments of digital learning into investments of digital technology to improve learning outcomes. This is important because of the legacy of high cost, low impact in EdTech investments. We don't want to see any more situations of hundreds of thousands of devices, for example, sitting in school storerooms. And as we reimagine education with digital technology into the future, we want those devices and EdTech investments to transform teaching and learning possibilities. And the Digital Learning Toolkit seeks to help stakeholders locate EdTech investments in a change process that leads to learning. So the toolkit was developed by UNICEF in close partnership with Aga Khan Foundation and with technical support from the Innovation Unit, and with really valuable input from a range of stakeholders from Kenya and Cameroon. And the background to developing the toolkit was some research that we published back in late 2018 that was about looking into the EdTech context, particularly in the sub-Saharan African sub-region. And we learned through that research about what I've mentioned earlier, the legacy of high cost, low impact EdTech investments. But we also learned about some projects that were showing a pathway towards success, EdTech investments that lead to learning. And we were able to observe from those projects a range of principles and approaches that they took to succeed. And these are the principles that are in front of you. And at this point, I'd like to hand over to Andy, to invite him to introduce himself, and then he will explore these principles, how that informed the Digital Learning Toolkit. And then I'll come back towards the end to talk a bit about the use. Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Shiraz. And this has been a fantastic webinar. And I think probably for some of us but now we're talking about digital learning. You know, where is the kind of linkage? And I think just building on Shiraz's point, you know, when we're thinking about COVID-19 and the post-COVID-19 era, when we have an estimated 1.3 billion children around the world not accessing internet or being able to log on, as UNICEF's Executive Director Henrietta Fore said, that's not a digital gap, that's a digital canyon. And so when we're thinking about designing and responding to the realities behind the hybrid new era of connected and offline learning, we need to really unpack not only the costing, but the value that is behind the design of EdTech for improving learning outcomes and environments. So as on the screen, the first set of research really lays out 10 domains or guiding principles. And many of us have seen this in practice, but sometimes when we're designing programs or evaluating interventions or convincing government and non-governmental partners, we sometimes forget to include reflections on the ultimate purpose and problem solving around what the EdTech solution is trying to address. What levels of student and teacher capabilities are already existing or perhaps are not existing around EdTech? What levels of agency do students and teachers have in their design of EdTech for learning? And then in particular, what is the technological infrastructure, the culture of implementation and change to enable different tools in the classroom and outside of the classroom, which then goes into questions of enabling environments, resources, coalition, and risks. If we can move to the next slide, This was a great list for many of our colleagues and countries, but they asked us, how do you actually bring these 10 domains into practical tools and approaches? Shiraz, can you go to the next screen?
Shiraz might have a
if he's
problem with his
frozen, I
connection.
can maybe take over. Should I just share my screen then? Speaking of ed tech and risks and coalition.
Is the presentation frozen?
Yes, Sobi, you can see that it's frozen, yes?
Yeah, he is. If you can move on, perhaps, Andy, until Shiraz is properly reconnected.
Indeed. Let me just try to share from my screen so that we can continue at least with the visuals. Just give me 1 minute. Hopefully you can see, Sobi, the screen now.
Yeah, very good.
Thank you so much. So why then move to a volume 1 and volume 2 around actually a digital learning toolkit? So it's taking those 10 domains and making them into practical tools and exercises to enable to put people at the center of the costing and design around ed tech for learning. And so we're addressing what Shiraz said through these 2 toolkits around addressing the issue of high cost and low impact of investing in ICT for education, and really rooting these investments in reality, not perception, so more context-driven and education actor agency, focusing investments on learning for all, so around the education questions, rather than questions of only logistics and hardware, and locates also that costing and contextual analysis within a broader inclusive strategic and development process. So how do we fail fast, learn fast before investing big? And the reasons why we have volume 1 and volume 2 is as you go through each one of the toolkits, we also have 7 people that really kind of bring sort of profiles of change. So in the volume 1, it is really meant to help head teachers, teachers, and students to go through these different steps around how we might be actually designing not only for learning with ed tech, but also for being the leaders of that ed tech. And so we have here illustrated, and you look in the toolkits, but we have Mumbi, a head teacher, we have Yanda, the male teacher, and we have Zebeda and Sarabi as the 2 students. And throughout all the different steps, which we really have in 4 different steps, taking those 10 domains and making those 4 steps, is in step 1, you're investing your time in really addressing how you understand the risks of investing in ICT for learning, but also understanding the risks of not investing in ICT for learning. You also then prioritize your problem by having interview surveys with students, teachers, and community members to understand and to be able to analyze data through a COIN analysis, the challenges, opportunities, insights, and needs, particularly around what are the learning challenges in terms of outcomes and what are the learning environment challenges in terms of the school climate. After step 1, there is a moment where you might actually understand it's not an ed tech solution in terms of your prioritized problem in learning. And that is a key step in this costing that sometimes is missed, of perhaps we don't need to leap to a budget, we need to actually deepen our understanding of the contextual realities of what we're trying to solve. Then we move to step 2, which is really enabling us to be able to create for the very first time in many of our contexts, a school ICT for learning scorecard. And there are readily downloadable survey questions that allow you to ask students and teachers questions about their access to ICT, but also about their capability. Now, alongside that, there is a costing tool as well, where you are thinking through not only the infrastructure audit, but also the connection between the cost of teacher professional development, learner-centered hardware and software, teacher-centered hardware and software, and ICT basic infrastructure. Together with those different capability audits and costing surveys, you come up with your school ICT scorecard. I'm talking about volume 1 because this is a school level tool, but volume 2 introduces characters like Sebiat, who is a district head department of education, Nieri, a minister of education, and Inyang, an education official, where they actually get to create a district and national ICT for Learning scorecard. Again, all downloadable on the website shared in the chat. And then leading to step 3, that you've done your homework around identifying your problem, you've done your homework around creating the scorecards, and now you have a 50-day plan to prototype your EdTech solution in action. And from the outputs of that particular prototype, you are then equipped to develop not only a costed, an inclusive, but also an evidence-based proposal for rolling out an EdTech for Learning solution. So for us, the tool goes through all these different steps. It also allows you to pick and choose which steps perhaps are most meaningful for your context and also for your chapter of your EdTech learning journey. So before I pass it back to Shiraz, I'm one of the 2 global leads for education for the Aga Khan Foundation. And we work across 32 different countries, 16 of which have active education programs. But one of our initiatives is Schools 2030. And we are working with 1,000 schools over 10 countries for the next 10 years in partnership with a coalition of other foundations, the Lego Foundation, Portuguese, Jacobs Foundation, Oak Foundation, Dubai Cares, Wellspring, IKEA, and Ital Social Foundation. And we are leveraging aspects of this toolkit in countries that include Portugal, Brazil, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Pakistan, Afghanistan, India, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan, to really understand not only about what works in EdTech for Learning, but placing the who, the why, and the how at the forefront of not only the costing, but also of the planning for what may be most important decisions in the current status of teachers and learners' experiences, whether online or offline in this era. So we are excited to continue having this be a living document and also being a resource for any partners on the call or beyond of how this is also being used in practice. But passing it back over to Shiraz. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andy. And I won't take much more time because I'm aware of the limited time left we have for this webinar. And apologies for earlier, my internet cut off. The rain is coming in here in Nairobi, and that sometimes happens. So really, this is just to say we believe that there is a lot of wider use of the toolkit from emergent contexts where EdTech considerations are just beginning, and to put those contexts on a sure footing so that EdTech links to learning, to more mature contexts where maybe EdTech is part of the education landscape, but the toolkit can be used to assess progress, assess impact, course correct. And then there's many use cases, from government to develop national policy, to school transformation, to enabling and empowering teachers and students to maximize their innovation in using technology for learning, and also in terms of building resilience to strengthen school systems in the context similar to what we're experiencing now, to ensure that school systems can keep learning going through crisis, but also with development partners to help enable them to stay connected to ICT for Learning debates and ensure that their efforts and investments connect to learning. So with that, thank you to Sophie and the team that has invited us to speak. Our contact details are here. We'll be very happy to speak to anyone, any partner who would be interested in using it. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks to both of you for presenting this toolkit on digital learning and for unpacking the design of EdTech, the domains, but also just not only in terms of the costing, but the steps to take in terms of planning. Thanks also for having shared the link to the toolkit in the chat. We've got just a little over 5 minutes left. I do want to hand it over to Omar from the World Bank to react to the 4 presentations. And I do want to recall that a couple of observations and questions in the chat, if you can also take those on board, that would be good. One in reference to the costing specifically on early childhood, and the second about the cost of identifying and programming for and trying to identifying learning loss, programming for, and resolving in particular for those who were the furthest behind even pre-COVID closure, school closures. Over to you, Omar, for as discussant and for reactions to the four panel presentations. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and again, thank you for the invitation. I mean, I think in the interest of time, I'll try to do this really quick. I mean, there's been a lot of information presented, very rich, all very relevant. So what I thought might be useful is, that maybe, as I was listening to the presentations, I had, of course, gone through them, but obviously I'm very familiar with the work that Alak and Jillian have presented. Maybe I think there's three main takeaways that, if people who are connected perhaps can reflect on in their work, I think, will be useful. The first, I would say, is that one of the key contributions of proper costing is that it can help us get clarity on what we want and we need to do. And I think, this may be the least obvious of all, because, you might think, well, we define what we want to do. We define a program, an intervention, a plan, and then we just need to cost it. So that's usually the way we think about costing, and then, the derivations to that in terms of budgeting, financing strategies. But what we have learned through the work that Alak and Jillian have presented, particularly with the work on costing COVID responses, is that actually a good costing protocol, a good costing tool can actually identify blind spots, gaps. I mean, things that you will not plan for or forget that you actually need. That you need, I don't know, hand sanitizers as part of your package for safe reopening. That if you're planning to deploy digital learning tools, you might need adapters. Things like that then become bottlenecks in implementation. So that's what I mean when I say that costing can actually help you get clarity in terms of what you need and what you want to do in implementation. Now, I would say one, again, lesson coming, I think, from all presentations is that there's a balancing act that we need to achieve there in terms of the comprehensiveness of costing tools, templates, and the need for flexibility. And again, we've seen that in the work that we have been doing on costing COVID. That, on the one hand, we want to be very comprehensive in terms of everything you might need, but not everything might be needed in all contexts. So tools themselves need to adapt to context, and with that, you will need to obviously forego a bit of comprehensiveness. And then rigor, the other balancing act is between rigor and ease of use. Again, very complex, and you can go crazy with simulation tools, but that become very difficult to implement and require a lot of technical capacity, then will not be friendly and not useful. Second key takeaway, I would say, is that costing, obviously, and this is perhaps more natural, and has already been referred to by Rob and in the opening remarks. I would say that costing is absolutely essential to ensure adequacy of funding for any program, but particularly education, particularly in this context of both safe reopening, but also moving to what we're calling stage of learning acceleration post-COVID. It can be very powerful in budget negotiations with ministries of finance, because when you have a very well-grounded ask, then the people in finance tend to listen more carefully because they understand that you have clarity. But also, then you can, again, it goes back to having clarity on what you need. You can more properly ensure that you are funding the usual things that we underfund, the non-salary costs, the non-salary inputs that are needed for proper implementation and having an impact. There are applications to that go all the way from an intervention, as Alaka was presenting, for instance, on early childhood education, but more broadly we're, for instance, doing some work now on costing strategies to reduce learning poverty as part of our work on with what we're calling the accelerator countries. An important thing there again is that, and we saw that with the presentation on the cost of digital and improving remote learning, is that the estimates need to kind of be feasible and credible. I mean, if we have figures that are will be overwhelming, it will just shut down dialogue with ministries of finance. And one way, that doesn't mean that we don't need to be realistic. It means that we need to present them contextualized. Again, we need to benchmark, we need to time things, so you don't need all the money in 1 year. You need to come up with a path of financing that can then be accommodated in a budget process over time. Final point, costing can be absolutely critical to improve the equity, efficiency, and effectiveness of spending. And one particular, application of this is that usually when you have good costing, you can more properly use results-based financing to tie funding to outputs or results, intermediate results usually. When you have good unit costs, for instance, you can more properly fund schools or districts that have high learning poverty. You know that costing there, that the cost of providing education might actually be higher there. So if you have good unit costing, you can have a better chance of properly funding those needs. The same goes for school grants, or even use of results-based financing in subnational allocation, like we have seen effectively in the case of the state of Ceará in Brazil. Let me stop there, just so that we have at least a few minutes for closing. Thank you again very much, and this has been really rich, and hope everybody has find it useful.
Thank you very much for that, Omar. I think that those were very useful thoughts based on what we heard through the various presentations, and based on experience that you have gained in different contexts. Just to flag, we are at the end of our webinar. Just to flag that in the chat, Haugen has provided, at least from a UNICEF perspective, some response to the questions relative to costing ECD programs, and to the focus on equity, costing of equity in the reopening of schools and dealing with learning loss. Haugen, over to you or to Nicolas for some closing words.
Yeah, I think we can over to Nicolas.
Thanks a lot, Haugen and colleague, and thanks a lot to all the presenters. I think it was a great moment. And as a continuity of what Omar said just before, I think that we dealt today with a series of tools that are linked really to costing of reopening, costing of digital learning, and recognizing also that the experience of countries and institutions during the past months has probably set the stage to further develop alternative learning pathway. So I will not come back on all the discussion, but I would like to just remind the word of Susan Grant-Lewis, Director IIEP, at the beginning of this session, which is costing is the first step, and we really need to ensure sustainability of budget in order to ensure that the prospective intervention, the design intervention, the costed intervention are really funded. So in that regard, I would say that I would go with 3 takeaways additional to what Omar said, or confirming what Omar said. First of all, national planning remains the key to ensure conceptualization and ownership of all those tools, and alignment of the different stakeholders are really a critical step. I mean, sine qua non, all those initiative or tentative to reimagine education could remain anecdotal if they are not properly included into proper education sector planning processes. So, of course, nationally driven, and all the more, my colleague Haugen showed in his presentation that we have hidden costs that we need to take in consideration, but that are not in control of the education sector. So the question should be, how does expanding digital learning solution looks like in a country where barely 30% of the population only has access to electricity? Second thing is the equity lens of the national education sector planning. So focus on reopening and introduction of digital learning should lead us to really keep an equity focused approach and recognizing that children's needs are different from one subcycle to another. Do we really think that the digital learning solution can be implemented the same way from early childhood education to higher education? But also considering the special need of children that are the most marginalized from the poorest family, which will be probably exacerbated due to one of the shock of the pandemic on the household income, for instance, but also children with disabilities and with delays in learning who have suffered by having no access to special assistance during this pandemic. Also, children of ethnic minority, children of migrant parents. So really focus on reopening, focus on digital learning should, make us more cautious to keep the lens on the equity approach. And finally, I think the assessment of learning is the last thing that is critical and key for the success of all those interventions. Assessing learning loss, of course, but also assessing to what extent children and adolescents can really catch up and learn using digital learning solutions. So again, the need for learning assessment to be really embedded strongly in education sector planning processes and supported by all the education community. Those would be my 3 takeaways. And now, I would like really to thank again all the contribution, all the presentator. Also recognize once again the really fruitful collaboration between UNESCO institutes and the World Bank. I think this was the 11th webinar, and beyond the webinar, we did a lot of production together. Let's really, hope that this fruitful collaboration continues as it was done recently. And finally, I saw that we reached almost 200 participants at some point. So it will be time to also thank all the participants, because without the participants, we will not do those webinars. So thanks a lot to you all, and looking forward for the number 12 webinar, hopefully. Thanks.
Thank you, Nicholas. And I hope you all enjoy the webinar. Let's keep the cooperation, and let's keep in touch on improving the costing tools. And again, good morning, good afternoon, and have a good evening to some of you. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.